Discussion on military affairs. The Russia-Ukraine war is not only reshaping the situation in Donbass or Crimea, but it is also indirectly shaking one of the Kremlin's most strategically impregnable fortresses, right in the heart of NATO. Here are the main points. From space, the truth behind satellite images revealing military bases along the Nordic border and the incident where Kaliningrad airport was choked off from the skies. Poland's tightening noose, the diplomatic campaign that blinded Russian intelligence, and the massive $2.5 billion defense project called the Eastern Shield. Lithuania's strike to cut off the main artery, the plan to dismantle the Soviet-era broad-gauge rail line, and the sky-high prices to unlock energy sources. A region with a deeply rooted identity, the collapse of Russia's Detroit, Russia losing 15% and the elite population leaving in disguise. The following is the content and detailed analysis. Putin is powerless in the face of the deadlocked Kaliningrad situation, and NATO shows no mercy. Ladies and gentlemen, few would have expected that, in order to concentrate all resources on the open conflict between Russia and Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin would accept a life-or-death risk by withdrawing all elite station forces and even dismantling the S-400 air defense shield in the Kaliningrad enclave to throw them into the frontline fire. This deadly gap was immediately detected by Western neighboring countries, paving the way for an unprecedented, brutal, multi-layered blockade campaign. Most of the 30,000 elite soldiers who used to be the steel shield in the Leningrad military district, the city of St. Petersburg, the border area with Finland, and especially the strategic overseas territory of Kaliningrad, have been directly deployed to the Ukrainian front. Even more tragic is the fate of the 11th Infantry Corps, an elite special force of 12,000 troops established 6 years earlier, with the ultimate mission of protecting the survival of Kaliningrad. Under the pressure from the West, so that vital military force has now been cut off from the land they were assigned to protect, thrown into the brutal vortex of war, leaving behind a vast gap in defense. Moscow faces a very high cost for the decision to strip Kaliningrad. These military units were once symbols of deterrence, representing Russia's most fearsome force in the heart of NATO. Directly facing the Baltic countries and the buffer zone south of Finland, they are now gradually melting away and being depleted in the muddy inferno of the Donbass front. The few remaining forces at home are just an exhausted skeleton, completely powerless to defend Kaliningrad if a major conflict breaks out. Because the highest-ranking general of the Western military alliance summed up the situation with a definitive statement: if Russia truly believed that NATO was massing troops near the border to threaten them, they would never foolishly withdraw these elite soldiers. The threat from NATO has long been just a political excuse and has never been the core reason. The nature of NATO is that it is a defensive alliance that does not pose a threat to Russia, and the Kremlin leadership understands this better than anyone. If they saw the West as a mortal threat, they wouldn't have completely emptied the Leningrad military district to send expeditionary forces to Ukraine, leaving Kaliningrad completely exposed to the storms. Now, the price to pay for that power vacuum is turning into immediate military challenges. The Finnish intelligence agency has exposed the scale of this hollowing out with undeniable evidence. Satellite images monitoring Russian military bases along the border reveal a shocking reality. The barracks are almost empty shells with no personnel. Up to 80% of the equipment and personnel have been sent to the battlefield in Ukraine. At many outposts, the number of stationed soldiers is less than 1/5, and in some places, they have been almost completely abandoned. The Kremlin still uses the specter of World War II to intimidate the Nordic countries. But the reality on the ground shows that Russia is completely unprepared for a direct war on the Finnish border. Satellite footage doesn't lie. Polish diplomat Balansados Tosikowski also confirmed a similar scenario when most of the forces in Kaliningrad had disappeared. Even the Lithuanian Ministry of Defense reported that many key defense units here had been pulled back to reinforce the fierce front lines. The soldiers who were born and trained to defend the Kaliningrad fortress are now falling in another land, in the name of a different war. British military intelligence had earlier confirmed a significant strategic setback. Russia was forced to dismantle several state-of-the-art long-range S-400 air defense systems from Kaliningrad to deploy them inside Ukraine in order to compensate for heavy losses from enemy attacks. The S-400 has been likened to a great protective umbrella over Kaliningrad. With a range of 400 kilometers, it is capable of controlling and dominating most of the airspace over Lithuania and Poland. A report from London bitterly concluded that the Russian Ministry of Defense's willingness to risk putting all of Kaliningrad in danger has demonstrated the severe exhaustion and overload of the country's core modern military capabilities. However, the heaviest armored force here, the 336th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, has also been drawn into the war in Ukraine. According to strategic analyses, as of April 2026 by the Defense Vipoy organization, this Marine force has been so deeply damaged that it will take many years to fully rebuild it. Putin not only sacrificed the soldiers of Kaliningrad, but also put up as collateral the region's strongest defensive shield. Deeply aware of this deadly gap, Moscow is frantically searching for ways to fill it, but the solutions they propose only create a new, deadlocked cycle of contradictions. In 2024, the 44th Infantry Corps was established in the Republic of Karelia, and at the same time, Soviet-era barracks in Petrozavodsk began to be rebuilt and urgently upgraded. New barracks, training grounds, and military equipment warehouses are being hastily built just 160 kilometers from the Finnish border. In Kandahar, about 100 kilometers from the Finnish border, the construction of bases for new artillery and engineering brigades is also being accelerated. On paper and in reports, this plan looks impressive with a new core force of up to 15,000 troops, but the harsh reality tells a completely different story. Most of the soldiers of the 44th Corps are currently not present at the base, but are directly engaged in combat on the front lines in Ukraine. The Petrosavo Center is still just a construction site full of rocks, while the buildings in distant Kandahar have only reached the foundation stage. Even the mechanized infantry brigade in Luga, although it was recently upgraded to a division with an expected size of 8,000 to 10,000 troops by the fall of 2025, all of this unit's weapons and equipment will also be confiscated and sent to the Ukrainian front. Russia is falling into its own trap, using one hand to mold bullets, and then using the other hand to throw its new units into the flames of war. When one strategic wound is patched, another gaping hole appears elsewhere. And now this dangerous military gap is no longer just a theoretical issue on operational maps. It is bringing about immediate and risky consequences. Aware of the looming threat overhead, Russia is desperately trying to cope and prepare for the worst-case scenarios. Satellite imagery data from May 20th revealed urgent construction activity at Chkalov, the most important naval airbase in Kaliningrad, located just 4 kilometers northwest of the city. Here, the construction of 4 solid aircraft shelters has begun in earnest. This base is home to the Russian Baltic Fleet's Naval Aviation Unit and the 689th Guards Fighter Regiment, which is equipped with heavy Su-30M fighters and Su-24M bombers. When the S-400 long-range air defense system was withdrawn to Ukraine, these valuable assets in the sky were no longer as strictly protected as before, and the Russian military understands this vulnerability better than anyone. These shelters were built to withstand drone attacks. However, analysts believe that they are only made from brightly colored shaped metal sheets, and their resistance is extremely limited in the face of a real airstrike. However, the hasty appearance of these protective shelters is a silent but bitter confession from the Kremlin about the decline of its defenses right at its far eastern fortress. The harsh truth is that the Kaliningrad fortress is now completely exposed to airstrikes, and this is no longer just a prediction on paper. Suddenly, that fear became a genuine alarm when the skies over this overseas territory were unexpectedly choked. For the first time since the war broke out, Kaliningrad's Kybrovo International Airport was forced to shut down urgently. Dozens of civilian flights were left waiting, with passengers helplessly circling in the air, completely unable to land on the runway. Russia's emergency alert system repeatedly sent out warnings about a threat from drones, forcing the Russian Federal Aviation Agency, Rosaviatsia, to activate emergency procedures, a top-secret emergency procedure used only when flight safety is seriously threatened. Even though the Kremlin chose to remain silent in public and claim there was no damage, geopolitical observers all understand that this is a bitter indirect admission. When looking at the isolated geographical location of Kaliningrad, the first name to come under suspicion is Ukraine. Kyiv has continuously expanded the combat capabilities of long-range drones, proving their ability to penetrate air defense fire to strike targets deep behind Moscow. If those shadows in the sky really came from the direction of Ukraine, it means that Kaliningrad has come into the enemy's sights, not just in theory, but as a harsh military reality. The strategic gap caused by the depletion of troops, the dismantling of advanced S-400 air defense missile systems, and the exhaustion of the Marine forces is now looming over the heads of the people of Kaliningrad. A fortress that was once a source of terror, a dagger pointed straight at the heart of NATO, now struggles and scrambles to find ways to protect itself against cheap drones. The decline of the Baltic fortress has not gone unnoticed by its southern neighbor, Poland. Warsaw immediately launched a calculated, multi-layered strategy of strangulation, starting by blinding its opponent before erecting steel walls. In a cold diplomatic campaign, Poland systematically shut down Russian consulates from Poznan through Gdansk to the last stronghold in Gran. These were not merely diplomatic buildings. The consulate in Gdansk alone had long operated as a massive signals intelligence center for Moscow. Arrays of rooftop antennas constantly monitor every harbor movement, multi-crew warships, and radio communications across the Baltic Sea. Meanwhile, the facility in Poznan served as the watchful eye monitoring military exercises, shipments of tanks, and trains carrying Western ammunition in Western Poland. Eliminating this presence has left the Kaliningrad garrison completely blind and deaf, losing its ability to locate and predict strategic moves across the border. With the adversary plunged into darkness, Poland began to revive the grand project of the Eastern Shield. This is considered the greatest border fortification campaign since World War II, with a massive budget of up to $2 billion USD to build a solid three-layer defense line, stretching for hundreds of kilometers along the border. 4-meter deep anti-tank trenches, 6 rows of dense reinforced concrete dragon's teeth barriers, along with a system of camouflage bunkers and defensive minefields, are turning the border into an impenetrable zone. Not stopping at the military aspect, Poland dealt a critical blow to the economic lifeline by completely closing the Gronogo and Godap border checkpoints. The remaining border crossings have fallen into a semi-paralyzed state, with wait times stretching for dozens of hours, causing international insurance companies to immediately classify Kaliningrad as a conflict risk area and refuse to provide insurance for transport vehicles. This practical sanction has pushed 18,000 truck drivers in this territory into unemployment, completely isolating their economy. The peak of the deterrence was the full-scale military exercise codenamed GAS, involving the entire top leadership from President to Prime Minister of Poland, rehearsing scenarios for martial law and evacuating the government to secret command centers in the event of a conflict. Poland's Minister of Defense affirmed that this is not just their own line, but the common border of both the European Union and the NATO bloc. The southern gate of Kaliningrad has been officially sealed, and the key to its fate now rests firmly in Warsaw's hands. With the southern route tightly locked, all eyes turn to the eastern gate, where the vital railway runs through Lithuanian territory to connect Kaliningrad with mainland Russia. For decades, this sole route has been the lifeline for 1 million residents and the entire garrison, transporting everything from fuel, cement, and steel to food supplies. Cutting off this route would mean suffocating Kaliningrad. Lithuania once tested this dangerous move by unilaterally restricting the transport of strategic goods under European Union sanctions, forcing the governor of Kaliningrad to sound the alarm about the risk of losing half of the region's regular goods supply. While the Kremlin was furious and issued dire threats of war, in the end, the cool-headedness of this NATO member nation prevailed, proving that the warnings were nothing but empty bluffs with no real power backing them up. The opportunity for Lithuania to take decisive action came from an unexpected incident when hot air balloons smuggling cigarettes from Belarus crossed the border and paralyzed Vilnius airport. Seeing this as a deliberate hybrid attack, Vilnius immediately closed border checkpoints and set the stage for a crippling move. The Lithuanian railway sector announced a complete suspension of all Russian oil product shipments to Kaliningrad to comply with US and UK sanctions, targeting the two energy giants Lukoil and Zuznev. After the brief transition period ended, Lukoil Group's oil and gas flow was completely cut off. Statistics have revealed the massive scale of this blow. From over 300,000 tons of transshipped oil per year, that vital flow has suddenly dropped to exactly zero. This is not only a blow that shuts down the civilian energy supply for 1 million people, but also a shot that cuts off the lifeblood for Russia's struggling war machine in the Baltic region. This tight dependence not only weighs heavily on civilian life, but even the warships of the Baltic Fleet and the Iskander strategic missile launchers are being drawn into this dangerous spiral. Vladimir Putin's most valuable blackmail tool is neutralizing itself under an invisible but brutal pressure. On the geopolitical chessboard, a threat aimed at total elimination is being realized by the Baltic countries, completely removing the broad-gauge railway standard from the Soviet era to switch to the European standard gauge. The Rail Baltica mega-project aims to create a modern route running from Tallinn to Warsaw, not simply laying down new tracks, but completely replacing the old system. There are no legal barriers that can prevent this move, because the historic 2002 transit agreement never included any provisions to protect the old long-distance railway infrastructure. When this infrastructure is officially changed, Russian trains will permanently be unable to run to Kaliningrad due to the complete incompatibility in train car sizes. The eastern door is slammed shut, the roads are blocked, the railways are cut off, but the most terrifying vulnerability lies in the lifeline: energy, because a city without electricity is not simply plunged into darkness, but the heartbeat of an entire living entity coming to a halt. For decades, Kaliningrad was sustained by Brel, the Soviet-era power grid connecting Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania on the same frequency to share a stable and cheap energy source, automatically compensating for and preventing any power outages. Now, the Baltic countries have decisively severed that umbilical cord to connect to the European NTSO-E power grid, pushing Kaliningrad into complete isolation like a lone energy island in the ocean, forced to struggle for survival within a separate system. Putin's energy security plan suddenly turned into a lottery game, relying entirely on fate. The last lifeline is the gas pipeline running through Belarus and Lithuania, but the power over this pipeline lies entirely in the hands of Vilnius. When the 10-year transit agreement expires in the last days of 2025, Lithuania's Ambergris company and Russia's Gazprom group signed a new 5-year contract valid until 2030. But on one harsh condition, Vilnius increased the transit fee nearly 30 times, raising the revenue from 1 million euros to 30 million euros. The message sent was extremely cold. The gas flow keeping Kaliningrad from freezing in winter is passing through Lithuania's valve. And if Moscow wants to keep that valve open, they have to pay an exorbitant toll. Not to mention, this agreement will end in 2030, and Lithuania has no obligation to extend it. The V-Toto car factory, which was once proudly called the Detroit of Russia, with assembly lines for luxury cars like BMW and Hyundai, is now nothing more than an abandoned warehouse, silent like an industrial graveyard, because the supply chain for parts was completely cut off due to Western sanctions. The winding sea routes have caused transportation costs to soar by 20%, a burden that the locals bitterly refer to as the overseas tax. A bag of cement now costs 3 times more than before the war because sea freight charges have increased 6 times compared to land transport. Inflation in the region has soared to 10.2%, far exceeding the national average, pushing 1/3 of local businesses into bankruptcy. When the economy collapsed, a massive wave of people fled, but not toward the West, which had already closed its doors. Instead, there was a reverse migration deep into Russia, heading toward Moscow, St. Petersburg, or Krasnodar. It is estimated that about 100,000 to 150,000 people have left since 2022, accounting for 10 to 15% of the region's total population. What is tragic is that those who left are not retired elderly people, but the elite, the backbone of society, engineers, doctors, and IT specialists in their prime working years, from 25 to 45 years old. The lifeblood of an entire region is packing up and leaving. Even migrant workers from Central Asia who once came here to make a living have had to sadly return to their homelands because there are no more opportunities to stay, pushing Kaliningrad into an unprecedented crisis of identity. Even so, Russia is not entirely out of cards to play. Kaliningrad is still home to strategic Iskander nuclear missile complexes, with a destructive range that covers all European targets. The Kremlin once arrogantly played this card to threaten at the start of the war, but Lithuania did not back down thanks to the solid protection of Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Until April 2026, when Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko accused NATO exercises of being a rehearsal for seizing Kaliningrad, those threats could not turn into concrete actions because an army bogged down and bleeding on the Ukrainian battlefield had no way to open a second front. Each threat made became less and less convincing, and the other side understood that clearly. When blackmail lost its effectiveness, the only realistic option left was to increase resupply by sea. Even though ferry traffic increased by 15%, this sea route could not be a lifeline for Kaliningrad. When each ton of goods transported by sea costs 4 times as much as by land, it eats into business profit margins and takes a toll on people's wallets. The ferry fleets move slowly and are completely unable to replace the massive volume of freight trains, causing many truck drivers to wait at the seaport for more than 2 months. But the biggest risk is security. With Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, the Baltic Sea has now officially become NATO's backyard. Russian cargo ships are always under intense Western surveillance, not to mention storms and winter ice, which can completely isolate this route at any time. At this point, Kaliningrad no longer has the strength to withstand anything. Putin's once proud fortress has now officially become a prison of its own making.